banker gave Harold Whitaker 30 days to prove the farm still had a future, and the very next morning, Harold drove his rusted old tractor into the most useless field in Miller County and started burying money in the dirt. At least, that was what everybody thought. The field sat on the east side of his farm, 40 acres of pale, stubborn ground that had broken better men than him. Nothing grew there except thistle, crabgrass, and a few crooked cedar saplings leaning away from the wind. The soil was hard enough to wring under a shovel. In July, cracks ran through it like old scars. In spring, water slid across the surface and carried away whatever seed a man was foolish enough to plant. So when folks saw Harold dragging rotted grape skins, chipped wood, aged chicken litter, and sacks of strange little bulbs across that field, they slowed their pickups on the dirt road and stared. By noon, 3 trucks had stopped near the fence. Harold did not look up. He was 60 years old, narrow in the shoulders, with gray stubble on his jaw, and hands that looked like they had been carved out of fence posts. His faded cap shaded his eyes as he walked behind the tractor, checking the shallow furrows he had opened with a plow older than most of the men watching him. Behind him, the field looked ruined on purpose. Dark strips of compost lay across the pale dirt. Wood chips blew in the wind. The sharp smell of old fruit and manure drifted all the way to the road. Some men laughed because it was easier than admitting they did not understand. A few shook their heads with honest worry. One woman from the next farm over watched quietly from her truck, not mocking him, not cheering him on, just trying to decide whether Harold had lost his judgment or found something everybody else had missed. Harold kept working. By late afternoon, the whole field was marked with narrow rows, low mounds, and long dark ribbons of mulch. He moved slowly, like every step hurt, but he never stopped. When the sun dropped behind the grain elevator in town, he was still out there, carrying sacks by hand, because the tractor had started coughing black smoke again. Nobody knew what he was planting. Nobody knew why a man already behind on his banknote would spend his last dollars on a field the county agent had once called exhausted. And Harold did not explain. The Whitaker farm had once been one of the cleanest places on County Road 9. Harold's grandfather had built the first barn with oak beams cut from the back pasture. His father had raised corn, soybeans, and cattle there for 40 years, through flood, drought, low prices, and 2 bad recessions. There had been a time when the Whitaker name meant straight fence lines, full grain bins, and a porch light that always burned at supper. But by the time Harold took over, most of that was gone. His father had spent his final years fighting sickness and bills at the same time. The cattle were sold first, then the newer baler, then the west pasture. The barn roof sagged, the machine shed leaked, the old John Deere only started when the weather was warm, and Harold spoke to it like a tired horse. The fences leaned so badly in places that deer stepped over them without jumping. The last corn crop had failed. The rain came wrong that year, too much in April, not enough in June, and nothing but heat in July. Harold watched the leaves curl, watched the ears stay small, watched the combine roll through dust and bring back almost nothing. When the elevator check came, it was not enough to cover seed, fuel, fertilizer, or the overdue note at the bank. Then came the meeting. The banker did not immediately take the farm. He did something worse. He gave Harold 30 days to bring in a written recovery plan, proof of a committed buyer, evidence that the Eastfield could produce income, and enough money to cover the interest and legal fees. If Harold failed to do that, foreclosure would begin. If the bank accepted the plan, he would get until the fall harvest to pay the balance. 30 days, not to save everything. 30 days to prove he was worth giving more time. Harold had sat at the kitchen table under the yellow light with that notice in front of him and his father's coffee mug beside it. The house was quiet, except for the refrigerator humming and the wind knocking a loose shutter against the siding. He could still see the dent in the wall where his father's chair had rubbed for 20 years. He could still smell pipe tobacco in the curtains, though his father had been gone nearly 8 months. Selling would have been easier. A land company had already offered to buy the place. They wanted to divide it into weekend lots for people from the city. A few neighbors hinted that Harold ought to take the deal before the bank took everything. They said he was too old to start over, too broke to experiment, and too sentimental to make a hard decision. Maybe they were right. But Harold could not look out at that land and see lots, signs, and gravel drives. He saw his grandfather walking behind a team of mules. He saw his father kneeling in the soil, rubbing it between his fingers. He saw himself at 12 years old, riding on the fender of a tractor, believing the farm would always be there. So when the banker gave him 30 days, Harold did the one thing nobody expected. He went to the useless field. The first reaction in town was laughter, but laughter was not the only sound. At Marlene's diner, some men leaned over coffee and made jokes about Harold planting trash. At the feed store, people asked what he was growing out there, and when nobody knew, they made guesses mean enough to get laughs. Some said he was planting weeds on purpose. Some said grief had finally twisted his judgment. Some said his father would have known better than to waste money on that piece of ground. But not everyone enjoyed the show. Old Ray Pritchard, who had farmed across the creek for 50 years, did not laugh. He only stared into his coffee and said the Whitakers had always known that ground better than outsiders did. A young clerk at the feed store slipped Harold a discount on fence staples without making a scene. The county agent came by with a skeptical face, but he brought soil sample bags instead of insults. The banker came by on the 6th day. He stepped out of a clean white truck in polished boots that had never sunk in mud. He stood near the edge of the field and watched Harold rake compost into a row by hand. Harold's shirt was already wet with sweat. Dust clung to his arms. One glove had a hole in the thumb. The banker did not mock him openly. Men like that rarely had to. He looked across the field, then at Harold, then at his clipboard, and his silence carried the same weight as a verdict. Harold kept raking. The county agent returned the next morning, more curious than cruel, but not much more hopeful. He had tested that field 2 years before and called it low organic matter, poor structure, low fertility, poor water retention, and unsuitable for conventional yield without major investment. He said it politely, but the meaning was plain. Dead ground. Harold listened, nodded once, and went back to work. The hardest part was not the laughter, it was the pity. People looked at him as if he were already gone, as if the farm had already slipped out of his hands, and he simply had not noticed yet. They spoke gently when they saw him at the gas station. They told him there was no shame in letting go. They said a man could only do so much. Harold never argued. He had never been much for speeches. His father had taught him that land did not care what a man claimed. It only answered what a man did, so Harold let the town talk. He rose before daylight, boiled coffee on the stove, folded the bank notice into his shirt pocket, and walked out into the dark. Only one thing in that house knew the full reason he kept going. An old wooden box sat under his father's bed. Harold had found it 3 nights after the bank meeting. Inside were notebooks, maps, seed receipts, soil tests from decades before, and his grandfather's field drawings made in pencil. Most of the pages smelled like dust and motor oil. Some were spotted with rain. Some had handwriting so faded Harold had to hold them under the kitchen lamp to read. The secret was there, buried in notes no one had opened for years. His father had written about the East Field again and again. Not as worthless ground, but as misunderstood ground. The field had never been good for corn. It was too dry on top, too gravelly in places, too exposed to the south wind. But beneath that hard crust, the soil drained well. It warmed early. It held just enough moisture when protected. Harold's grandfather had once used part of it for specialty crops before the county went all in on row crops and chemical fertilizer. One note stopped Harold cold. Dry field by the cedar line. Good for crocus if kept loose and covered. Needs life back in the soil. Do not plow deep. Do not drown it. Feed it slow. Below that, in his father's handwriting, was another line. Saffron, maybe. Too much hand labor for me now. Might save a small farm someday. Harold had read that sentence 10 times. Saffron. Most men in Miller County planted corn, soybeans, winter wheat, or hay. Saffron sounded like something from another country, something sold in tiny jars for more money than seemed reasonable. But Harold read everything in the box. He drove to the public library 2 counties over and used an old computer to study. He called a grower in Pennsylvania. He called another in Vermont. He learned about saffron crocus bulbs, dry summers, fall blooms, careful harvest, and the red threads inside each purple flower that chefs and food companies paid dearly for. It was risky. It was slow. It took hand labor, patience, and attention to details most people would never notice. But it did not need rich bottomland. It did not need heavy irrigation. It did not need the kind of fertilizer Harold could no longer afford. It needed well-drained soil, organic matter, weed control, careful timing, and a farmer willing to kneel. Harold had a useless field. He also had 30 days to convince the bank that useless was the wrong word. So he began. The rotted grape skins came from a small winery outside town that was glad to get rid of them. The wood chips came from a tree service clearing storm damage. The chicken litter came cheap from an old poultry farm, already aged and safe enough to mix. Harold spread everything thin, never too heavy, working it only into the top layer, because the old notes warned against tearing the soil open too deep. He laid out the rows by the slope of the field, not by convenience. He shaped shallow swales to catch what little rain came. He left strips of wildflowers between sections to bring bees, predatory insects, and shade for the soil surface. He planted saffron crocus bulbs by hand, one after another, until his knees burned and his back felt like a piece of split wood. At the end of the 30 days, Harold walked into the bank with dirt still under his nails. He did not bring promises. He brought soil test updates, photographs of the prepared rows, receipts for bulbs, letters from 2 specialty buyers willing to inspect his crop if it met grade, and a signed note from the county agent saying the field plan was unconventional but technically sound for a high-value specialty crop. The banker read everything twice. He did not look convinced, but the buyer's letters mattered. The county agent's signature mattered. The interest payment Harold scraped together by selling the last unused hay wagon mattered. The bank did not forgive the debt. It did not suddenly believe in him. It only agreed to delay foreclosure until after the fall harvest, with the warning that there would be no second extension. That was not mercy. It was a narrow door. And Harold walked through it. Still, getting more time did not make the work easier. By the second week of summer, the tractor broke a belt. Harold spent half a day under it in the dust, grease dripping onto his cheek, knuckles bleeding where a wrench slipped. By the 3rd week, the well pump started kicking off in the afternoons. He patched the pressure switch with parts from a coffee can in the shed. A storm missed them by 4 miles, and he stood at the edge of the field, watching clouds drop rain on somebody else's land. Nothing green appeared. The field looked worse than before. Every evening, Harold wrote in his notebook: soil temperature, moisture under mulch, wind direction, wildlife tracks, places where the ground stayed cooler, places where the compost dried too fast. He recorded every failure, not because it comforted him, but because his father had done the same. Bills stacked up on the kitchen table: fuel, seed, repairs, insurance, bank notices. One night in August, the doubt did not simply visit him. It sat down and stayed. Harold came in after dark with his shirt soaked through and his right knee swollen from kneeling in the rows. He put a can of beans on the stove, then forgot to light the burner. He stood there in the kitchen, staring at nothing, while the house creaked around him. The bank papers lay beside the sink. The buyer letters lay under a coffee cup. His father's notebooks were open on the table, their pages full of careful handwriting from men who were no longer there to answer for any of it. For the first time, Harold let himself imagine the auction clearly, not as a threat on paper. As a Saturday morning, trucks parked along the road, strangers walking through the barn, men opening drawers in the shop, someone starting his father's tractor without knowing how gently the choke had to be pulled, a white auction sign nailed beside the mailbox, the Whitaker name taken down like it had never meant anything. Then, he imagined something worse. He imagined that the town might be right, not because they were cruel, but because land could fail even honest men. Not every old notebook held wisdom. Not every stubborn man was brave. Sometimes stubborn was just another word for afraid to quit. Harold sat down slowly. He took off his cap and set it on the table. His hands were shaking. The kitchen light buzzed above him. A moth beat itself against the window. Rain tapped lightly on the tin over the back porch. Too little and too late. He looked at his father's photograph above the sideboard and felt, for one hard moment, not inspired by it, but accused by it. He had risked the last farm money on purple flowers no one in the county had ever grown. He had let people laugh. He had used his father's notes like scripture. And if he was wrong, he would not just lose land. He would make his father's final years look like a slow walk toward nothing. That night, Harold did not sleep. Near midnight, he put on his boots and walked out to the east field under a sky with no moon. He carried a flashlight and a shovel. The rows were dark humps in the beam. The wind moved through the wildflower strips with a dry whisper. He knelt in the dirt and dug carefully beside one of the planted bulbs. For a terrible second, he expected rot. He expected emptiness. He expected proof that he had mistaken memory for knowledge. Instead, he found a firm bulb with pale roots reaching into the cooler soil below the mulch. Not a miracle. Not a guarantee. Just life. Harold sat back on his heels, breathing hard. Then he covered it again, slow and gentle, like tucking in something small against the cold. He did not feel brave when he stood up. He felt tired. But tired was something he understood. Tired was something a man could carry. Before dawn, he made coffee, folded the bank letter away in a drawer instead of his pocket, and went back to the field. Then the drought came down hard. By mid-July, Miller County looked burned around the edges. Corn leaves rolled tight as cigars. Soybean fields lost their shine. Pastures turned the color of old rope. Cattle stood in ponds that had shrunk to mud holes. Every day the radio talked about heat advisories, falling yields, and farmers selling livestock early because hay was disappearing. The old men at the diner stopped laughing as much. The feed store ran short on mineral tubs and water tanks. Fertilizer prices jumped again, and men who had mocked Harold's compost started complaining about input costs. The county agent drove dusty roads from morning until dark, checking fields that all told the same story. Too hot, too dry, too late. Harold's saffron field did not look impressive. It did not stand tall and green. It did not promise anything to a man driving past at 40 miles an hour. For most of the summer, it looked quiet, almost empty, with mulched rows resting under the heat. That made some people laugh again. They said even his miracle crop had failed. But Harold knew saffron slept through heat. He knew the bulbs were waiting. The question was not whether the field looked good in July. The question was whether the life under the soil could survive long enough to answer in fall. The bank called again in September. The extension would end after harvest. There would be no more delay. Harold would need payment, proof of sales, or a signed purchase contract strong enough to satisfy the loan committee. He thanked them and hung up. Outside, the wind lifted dust across the yard. Then the nights cooled. The first sign came before sunrise. Harold was walking the east field with a flashlight when he saw a purple tip breaking through the mulch. It was so small he almost missed it. He stopped, lowered himself carefully, and brushed the soil back with 2 fingers. A saffron crocus. By noon, there were dozens. By the next morning, hundreds. Then the field changed. Across the rows that everyone had mocked, purple flowers opened in the cool morning light. They rose from the dry ground like a secret the soil had been keeping all along. Each bloom was small, delicate, almost too beautiful for a field known for failure. But inside every flower were 3 red threads, thin as hair, and worth more than anything Harold had ever pulled from that ground. Now, the real work began. Saffron did not wait for a man. Harold had learned that the flowers had to be picked before the sun climbed high, before the petals softened, before heat stole the strength from the aroma. So he started in darkness, with a headlamp strapped over his cap and a shallow basket hooked over his arm. The field was cold enough to numb his fingers. Dew silvered the mulch. His boots made soft crunching sounds in the rows. He moved carefully, bending at the waist, pinching each flower at the base and setting it into the basket without bruising it. He could not grab handfuls like hay. He could not rush like corn harvest. Every bloom demanded attention. The purple petals stained his fingertips. The scent was faint at first, green and earthy, then warmer as the baskets filled. By sunrise, the field glowed purple. By 8 o'clock, the first flowers were already beginning to loosen under the light. Harold worked faster, but never rougher. His back screamed, his knees throbbed. The old injury in his right hand stiffened until he had to stop and flex his fingers. Still, he kept moving down the rows, because every hour mattered, and every missed flower was money left to wilt. Inside the barn, he set the baskets on clean screens. Then came the slowest part. He sat beneath a hanging bulb and opened each flower by hand. From the center, he lifted the 3 crimson stigmas with tweezers and laid them on a drying tray. The threads were so light that a breath could scatter them. The color looked almost impossible against his rough fingers, red as a coal ember, red as a cut in the dark. The barn filled with a deep, warm smell as the first trays dried in gentle heat. It was not loud like harvest used to be. No combine roar, no grain truck rumble, no elevator line, just the quiet scratch of Harold's chair, the whisper of petals, the hum of a small fan, and the careful patience of a man pulling value from something most people had never bothered to see. He slept in pieces. 2 hours before dawn, 1 hour after supper, sometimes less. For nearly 3 weeks, the flowers came in waves. A neighbor's teenage daughter, the same girl who had watched him from the roadside that first day, came to help after school. Old Ray Pritchard showed up one morning without saying much and picked beside him until his back gave out. Even the county agent came on a Saturday, not as an official, but as another pair of hands. The town did not change all at once. Some still doubted. Some waited to see the check, but the laughter faded because the field had become too beautiful to laugh at. Harold sent the first dried sample to a specialty buyer he had contacted months earlier. Then he waited. 3 days later, the buyer called. The quality was excellent. Deep color, strong aroma, properly dried. They wanted all he could produce. Then a chef from St. Louis called. Then a small food company. Then a natural foods distributor looking for American-grown saffron with a story behind it. Harold did not understand half the language they used, but he understood the numbers. By the end of the harvest, the useless field had produced more value than any corn crop those 40 acres had ever seen. Not all at once, not like a fairy tale. It took long days, careful drying, packaging, inspections, buyer calls, lab paperwork, and shipping forms that made Harold's head hurt. Some trays dried unevenly and had to be downgraded. Some blooms were lost to rain. Some buyers talked big and paid slowly. But enough money came. Then contracts for the next season came. Then deposits came. Together, the harvest sales and purchase agreements gave the bank what it had demanded. Proof. Enough to bring the note current. Enough to stop the foreclosure. Enough to repair the well, patch the barn roof, and order more bulbs for the next season. The banker returned on a cold morning in November. This time, he parked by the fence and did not smile. The field was quiet again, rows mulched for winter, nothing flashy left to see. Harold was tightening wire along the roadside fence when the banker walked over. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved through the dry grass. Somewhere behind the barn, a loose sheet of tin clicked softly. Harold did not ask for an apology. He did not need one. The banker looked across the field, then down at the ground, then back at Harold with the expression of a man seeing a place for the first time after years of thinking he understood it. A week later, the county agent came with soil bags, a clipboard, and a different tone in his voice. He tested organic matter, he checked structure, he asked about mulch depth, bulb spacing, drainage, and harvest timing. Harold answered quietly, never more than needed. By winter, neighbors who had laughed began stopping at the fence without jokes. Some asked where he had bought the bulbs, some asked about compost. Some only stood there looking at the field, embarrassed by their own memories. Harold never made them feel small. He knew what it was to doubt. In December, after the last payment cleared and the foreclosure notice was withdrawn, Harold carried his father's wooden box to the kitchen table. He opened the notebooks and added his own pages behind them: soil readings, planting dates, harvest weight, buyer names, mistakes, weather patterns, notes for next year. At the bottom of the final page, he wrote one sentence: "The East Field was never useless. We just stopped listening." Then he closed the notebook and stepped onto the porch. The farm was still rough, the barn still leaned, the tractor still needed coaxing, the fences still had gaps that would take months to mend. Harold was not suddenly rich in the way people imagined when they heard the words $1 million harvest. He still wore the same coat, drank the same bitter coffee, and rose before daylight because animals, soil, and debt did not care about headlines. But the farm was his. The Whitaker name stayed on the mailbox, and the field that had been mocked, pitied, dismissed, and nearly sold now lay under the winter sky, holding thousands of quiet bulbs beneath the soil. In spring, Harold would plant more wildflowers. In summer, he would protect the ground from heat. In fall, the purple blooms would come again. Maybe neighbors would copy him, maybe they would not. That part did not matter as much as people thought. What mattered was that an old man had trusted the land when everyone else had judged it dead. He had trusted his father's notes. He had trusted his own hands. And when the whole town waited for him to lose everything, Harold Whitaker bent down in a useless field and harvested a future.